In this exercise, you can learn how to add assets to your canvas in an object-oriented manner, to where each thing placed on the canvas is an object with its own properties, such as its coordinates on the canvas, its fill color, sizing, and more. And this allows us to more effectively treat our canvas assets as distinct instances of objects, and it really helps avoid value collisions when we're animating many things simultaneously on the canvas. This code exercise will begin with the same exact code we left off with in the very last exercise where we discussed animation. So if you missed that lesson or you don't have the code, you can go and watch that and click the link to get the lesson code. Okay, so the goal is to add these two rectangles to our canvas in an object-oriented manner, and then we'll discuss its usefulness. So the first thing I'm going to do is go up above the animate function and type in function obj, short for rectangular object. Open close parentheses, put an opening curly brace, and then your closing curly brace. Now what we're going to do is start setting out the properties needed for this rectangular object. So the first property is this.x, and that's going to represent its x position on the canvas, equal to 0. Then we'll put in a comma, and since it's related, we'll put another property called y. We'll make that equal to 0 as well. Now the whole point of object orienting your assets is so that these properties can be different for each of the little rectangles. So even if I have 100 of them on the canvas, this has to say y, sorry about that. So even if I have to put 100 rectangles on the canvas, I can create new instances of this rect object, and each of them can have different x and y coordinates, and they change over time in your animations. And that's why object orienting your code is very handy. Now the next thing we'll do, since we have our properties laid out, let's establish a method of this object, and we'll name it render. So type in this.render is equal to function, and this function will allow us to intake some arguments. Let's get the curly braces in. Now the first argument we need this function render to intake is going to be the CTX object, and the next argument it will intake is the rectangle's x position, so we'll type in Rx. Then we need to know the rectangle's y position, so we'll type in Ry. We need to know the rectangle's width and the rectangle's height, and very last, its color. Okay, so now inside of this render method, that's where we're going to CTX dot put the fill style, and that's going to be equal to CLR, which is going to be our color argument that's coming into this function when it's called. And then finally we put CTX dot fill rect, and for this we need Rx, the rectangle's y position, the rectangle's width, and the rectangle's height. And keep in mind that the rectangle width and height can also be made as properties of this object. I'm just keeping it simple for this basic demonstration. Now we have our rect object all set up and ready to go. Now we can create new instances of that object, and as many as we want. So I'm going to type in a note that says establish assets outside of the animate function to avoid recreating them each time the animate function runs. So that's what we'll do. Type in var rect1 is equal to new rect object, open close parentheses, semicolon. Now let's create two, because we need two rectangles. We'll name the second one rect2, and it's also an instance of rect object. That means it will have an x property equal to 0 and a y property equal to 0, and it will also be able to call this render function, or this render method. Now sometimes you'll see people creating new objects within a loop. So you can set a loop to run 100 times and create 100 different objects on the canvas using 3 lines of code. But instead of doing it in a loop, I'm just going to create each individually so we don't get ahead of ourselves. Okay, so now what we'll do is go down where these two rectangles, we're establishing the fill style and drawing the rectangles to the canvas. We're going to remove those lines, and for the first rectangle we'll type in rect1.render method. We're going to pass the CTX object through it, and these are all the parameters that we're passing to it. So we can actually just copy those. Let's put those right in place here. Now the CTX object is available within the animate function, so we can pass that up into the rect object's render method. So that's why we're passing it through right there, and it's coming from right here. So our first rectangle had a static x position of 0, but it had a y position that was dynamic, so we type in rect1.y. And remember, rect1.y is a property of the rect object that we can access right here. this dot y. Now the width and the height I want to be 50, and the first rectangle was a magenta. So now to get the other rectangle drawn to the canvas and animated, I'm going to type in rect2, access the next instance of the rect object, and this one had a dynamic x position, so we type in rect2.x, and it had a static 0 y position, and it was also 50 by 50, and it was blue. It had a blue fill. Now instead of saying y++ and x++, what we're going to do is say rect1.y++ and rect2.x++. Now you'll see that you get the same results as before if you refresh. Alright, so what I'll do is add rect1.x here, rect1.x property, and for rect2 we're also going to add its y property. We should get the same effect. Now what that shows you is that this .y and this .x are remaining independent. So if you had 100 rectangles on your canvas, they would each reference their properties through this rect object, but they would all have different values for those properties. Now I'm going to make these go the same way, sort of like they're racing across the screen. So I'll put rect1x++, change it from y++ to x++, and let's see what that gives us. And they're right on top of each other, so I know in order to get that effect that I have to make the blue rectangle start at a different y position than 0. So what I'll do is I'll go up above my animate function, and I'll simply say rect2.y is equal to 50. Actually, let's make that 100, so it has some spacing in between the one above it, and then refresh. So you see? Now it looks like they're racing across the screen. We can see both of them together. And if you wanted the second one to go a little faster, you can just times 2, multiply some other speed factor onto its x position, refresh, and now it's winning the race. Now like I said, these other values, like for instance the width, the height, and the color of the rectangles, can also be established as properties of the rect object. So that means right when you create your new instance of those objects, you set its properties. So for instance, for the width, if I want to say rect1.w, and let's do the same thing for the second rectangle, rect2.w, that represents its width. So that means we go up into our object, we put comma, this dot width is equal to 0. And then when the object is created, we type rect1 dot width is equal to 50. Then we also have to do the same thing for rect2's width. So you create your instances of those objects, you supply them with any properties that they need that are different from the defaults that you have in place. So if they need to be different from the defaults that you have in place within the object, then you establish them here. Now we run that. There we go. If there was a collision in this and the second rectangle was inheriting the y property of the first rectangle, you would see problems in your application. This allows you to keep all of your properties for all of these object instances and separate and different. Okay, so that's how you can add assets to your canvas in an object-oriented manner, which allows you to use one constructor for many different assets. And you can more easily keep tabs, like on the x position and y position of where things are. So if you're programming a hit test function, and you have to know where the x and y coordinates are for each of the assets on your canvas within that function, that's when it comes in really handy. You just type in whatever object .x and you get its x position.